Started today with welcome to our panel, Build a Diverse Team that Reflects Your Community. I'm Sara Shahriari. I'm the Director of Leadership and Talent Development at INN, and I'm going to be your moderator for this panel. I am so very happy to introduce our panelists today. They are Celen Vasquez from Co-op Careers, Jayo Macasaquit, he's the Chief People Officer for the 19th News, and Miki Clayton from Nonprofit HR. So welcome, panelists, and thank you so much for sharing your time with us. Our producer, Emily, is going to drop bios for our speakers in the chat so you can learn more about their amazing work, honestly. And audience, thank you for being here. We're going to have time for questions at the end of our conversation. Let's get started. Jayo, I wanted to ask you about different ways that you think about building teams that reflect the communities that we serve. It's a phrase that we hear fairly often when it comes to staffing inside and outside news, but what does it mean to you in your work with the 19th?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sara, and thank you folks for inviting me on. When it comes to building a diverse team that reflects the communities we serve, like many of the aspirational things that organizations and many industries aspire to, they definitely sound good, but where folks really need to start is thinking about what they're even trying to accomplish. When we talk about diversity and equity, organizations don't often take the time to think about what equity actually means, like the hard numbers, what diversity means in terms of what they're trying to aspire to. And so it makes the work a lot more difficult when that intention hasn't been sort of set for them to work towards. So at the very, very forefront, asking yourself as an organization, what are you even trying to accomplish, which is a lot of what we try to do at the 19th, and then building a process around that and bringing intention to what we were saying when we talk about diversity and equity.
Thank you. And Miki, we'll go to you now. You work with a lot of different organizations of all different sizes in all different fields. When you see people in organizations that are already quite diverse in some respects, pushing to further diversify those teams, what does that look like? What does it look like to continue that process for people who've already made some steps in it?
Absolutely. And I think the first thing they can do is understanding, if you feel like you're already diverse, understanding what dimensions of diversity you're talking about, even talking about that. So if you are racially, ethnically diverse, that's one element of diversity. But what other elements going beyond that might you think about in terms of background, in terms of education, lived experience, things like that. So I think it's coming out of representative diversity, which is really important and critical, especially to the mission that you're serving. But when you're looking beyond that and you're looking to go a bit further, thinking about, as Jayo mentioned, what your intentions are, what you're really trying to accomplish, and understanding that diversity of thought, diversity of background, diversity of representation, all of those things are important in order to make some quality decisions.
Celen, I wanted to go to you with this question because you work with a lot of underemployed and first generation college grads who are going on to the job market and applying. And I wanted to ask you what come up on staff. They come out of the co-op program and go on to job market.
Yeah, definitely. So, navigating the job market can be really tough. There's a lot of applying and a lot of rejection. And, there's so much competition out there, whether that be someone else has more experience or they're coming from a different background that's, more the employer favors that more. And so I think that's one of the main hurdles for the co-opers is just, applying and getting a lot of rejection. And so how can they be given that one chance, like that one opportunity to just penetrate the job market, given their skills and their background? And I would definitely encourage hiring managers to look at candidates through a different lens. Like they may not have all of that experience, but they do have really great transferable skills. Look at other programs that they're a part of, like the co-op program. It's not something that they were forced to do. It's something they wanted to do to, grow their skills and to learn more about the industry. And so looking from candidates through that lens, I would encourage hiring managers to do. And then also, imposter syndrome is a huge thing that I typically see with candidates that I'm working with, is them not feeling like they necessarily belong, looking at job descriptions and seeing the experience that's needed, the skills that are needed, and sometimes that can be a little daunting to them. So for them, it's just finding a community where they can connect with each other and relate to each other on that level. And then that definitely helps them with applying and getting over that imposter syndrome.
Yes. And that's something that, we look at a lot when people are putting together job descriptions, is how many things do you absolutely need? Mm-hmm. And a very long list of must-haves can exclude a lot of people who might be valuable or who are feeling already like there might be a little imposter syndrome and dissuade them from applying. So really being intentional, as Jayo says, about the things that you need to have and about the things that people can learn on the job. And Celen, another interesting thing about co-op is that the organization talks about social capital a lot in terms of people who aren't connected to people who are already in the field. And that can also be a huge barrier to entry for your people. How do you talk with people about that?
Yeah, so we do so much work on our end to connect with employers in this space, to build that social capital, to make those connections for the co-opers who sometimes don't have that community or those resources. A lot of them are first generation college grads, so their families aren't able to talk to them about, who to connect with in the industry. How do you get that first time role? And so we do a lot of work on our end to be able to connect the co-opers with folks in the industry to help them make those connections and to get that entry level role.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Jayo, let's go to you and talk about recruitment and retention, in the sense that we've spoken about those things starting way, way, way before a job is even posted, that those have to really be teed up before you even think about talking to somebody about hiring them. What are some ways that organizations can prepare and think about recruitment and retention before they're even thinking about hiring?
Yeah. So this was a lesson in the news industry that was taught to me by a former manager, John Berry, at Mother Jones, also an INN member. But she emphasized, and which I agreed with, the importance of passive recruiting, and the fact that a role doesn't have to be, a hiring manager doesn't have to be currently hiring for a role to be recruiting. There's an issue in the news industry as a whole in terms of sourcing and how at times newsrooms have difficulty getting sources from communities that are speaking about the issues that are pertaining to those communities. And at times, newsrooms can be seen as swooping in and being extractive of those communities because those relationships have not been built over time. And so the same thing can be said about recruiting. More often than not, marginalized folks, are at times just tapped when it comes to roles that folks are hiring for out of nowhere and out of the blue, which can at times feel a bit tokenizing. And so to avoid that, hiring managers should look into ways where they can situate themselves in diverse networks and diverse network opportunities beforehand, and start building relationships with folks beforehand, even offering out mentorship to folks throughout the industry, so that when the time comes, when a role does come along, then it's a more organic approach instead of, hi, person of color, I Googled you, you should apply.
Thank you, Jayo. Great points there. And Miki, let's jump off of that and talk about some of the best practices for starting a hiring process. Once you've looked internally at your organization, this is a place that's done its work, and you are cultivating these networks and you're out there in constant conversation with people. how do you start a hiring process that really yields a dynamic and diverse applicant pool, especially for small organizations where everybody's kind of already wearing a lot of hats?
Yeah, like you mentioned, if the organization has really done that work and is prepared to not just look differently as a more diverse organization, but also think differently, operate differently, maybe feel differently, I think it's important to start leveraging that in some of their communications, sharing some of those partnerships or some of those opportunities that they've used to leverage, more diverse communities, and sort of use that as a tool to attract more diverse pool of applicants. I always say, as a person of color, could I see myself, as a neurodivergent person, could I see myself working there and being successful there? So I think in terms of your employer brand and attracting diverse talent is really important to start that hiring process, and really examining your hiring practices to ensure that they are equitable. Process equity is big in terms of hiring practice, and also sharing out, to Celen's point about, engaging communities that may have imposter syndrome or more newer to work or entry level, sharing giving a preview of what that hiring process is like can really alleviate some of that nervousness that candidates have when they're entering, for the first time, or even a seasoned employee. So I think understanding and examining your current hiring practices for process equity and inclusivity, where you can have diverse hiring panels, and then sharing out what that process looks like in advance can really help to attract more diverse talent.
I love that point that you're making there about what happens after you send in the application. It's not just like you step off a little cliff into darkness, right? That there's some idea of how that process is going to go, and that can give people confidence to take that step. Jayo, do you have any thoughts on what Miki's saying about transparency in that process and equity in that process of putting the job out there? I think you're muted, sorry.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I would just echo Miki's point around that process that you are able to go to and consistently apply to the hires across the board. But nothing else to add. I think Miki summed it up pretty nicely.
And Miki, another thing I really appreciate about what you said is that, be out there saying, we are working with different communities. We are looking to hire people. We are interested in people who are veterans, first generation college graduates, people from diverse backgrounds, that, if you are doing that work, you can talk about it. And then that will let people know what you're valuing there. Thank you.
Absolutely.
So Jayo, we'll bounce back to you. When you think about equitable compensation, because we know when people are getting hired for a job, people are coming to a job to be compensated for it. And when you think about that across an organization, how do you think about that, not just as salary and benefits, but also as time off, professional development, and resources? How do you frame that all together?
Sure. I mean, there's the short answer is there's a bigger idea around total compensation, and it's not just about salary. I would say salary takes all the air out of the room because it is the most crucial to many folks, and it is because it's just a sign of the dismal state of where compensation is for nonprofits and newsrooms across the board, and so you can't get past that hump unless you make a meaningful decision towards deciding what a living wage looks like for your organization, and how you could surpass that, how you're going to take care of things like people's different locations, how you're going to compensate for cost of living, and processes around making sure that decisions around pay are consistent, and that people know the difference between their pay. But in addition to that, I think that different people will have sort of different touch points or different engagement points in terms of what makes them feel like they're engaged in the organization and what makes them feel valued. And so key to that, you can pile on tons of benefits, depending on your capacity, but key to that will be asking folks what makes them feel engaged. Do they even care about time off, or is what they care about, a particular health plan? Your ability to be able to efficiently take stock of what motivates people and what people need will be key to your success in this front.
So essentially, ask people often because you don't have to guess what it is that's important to them in some ways. Yeah. Celen, I wanted to ask you about the co-op grads because we know that not everybody is comfortable negotiating salary in the same way. I, for example, am really painfully uncomfortable negotiating salary, and I continuously undercut myself on it. And I was wondering, with people who don't have a lot of experience with negotiating, how do you get them out there, and what is important to them that employers do around salary to make that recruitment process successful?
Yeah, absolutely. So salary can be a very daunting subject. I can go on about this subject in particular. A lot of times I see that, the co-opers, sometimes they don't even know that they have room to negotiate. And we're always recommending to them, yes, you do have room to negotiate, giving them the tools on how to do that. We have different resources within our orgs to have them be comfortable negotiating salary. But also on the flip side of that, I think something that employers could do is just be more transparent, whether that be on the job application or on their websites about like what is the actual range, what is the salary range that they're looking at, so that, if the candidate sees this is within my means, great, I'll apply to this. And if it's not, then they'll just move on. So I would say, we encourage the co-opers to do their research, but also on the flip side, the employers just being more transparent about what salary looks like, just so no one's wasting their time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Miki, in your work with different organizations, do you often encourage people to think about a minimum starting salary or salary bands, or how do you encourage people to phrase that as they're going out and recruiting?
Absolutely. I think first starting with, as an organization, based on your budget, based on how you operate, is to just come up with a compensation philosophy and framework that you can apply consistently. Not every organization will have the capacity to have something really robust, but you can have something. And we recommend to our clients, where you can, to have that externally examined so that you can have a true idea of what the market is paying. And then you can develop different pay bands that may be based on each individual position or position level or something like that. But I think the issue that happens is that organizations don't really feel confident in the framework that they have. So then they don't feel confident sharing that out. So I think starting in-house with just building what your overall compensation program looks like, so you can start utilizing that in a more equitable way. And then as your organization grows and scales, then you can engage whether you should have more, individualized pay bands, or what that sort of looks like at your organization. But you do have bandwidth to design that in a way that looks and works for your organization and your mission. But I think it's really important to have something that you can base what internal and external equity looks like at your organization.
Right, because if you hadn't sat down and talked about it, it's incredibly difficult to communicate something that isn't
Absolutely.
together. And it's also incredibly difficult to equitably apply something that doesn't really exist.
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Jayo, once an employer finds a great candidate and wants to make an offer, there are a lot of ways to weave equity and inclusion into that offer and onboarding process. How do you think about equity and inclusion as part of the offer and onboarding?
Sure. Well, as part of the offer goes, it's pretty easy. It's the earliest time that you can instill, obviously apart from the hiring process, but it's the earliest time you can instill a sense of belonging to someone who's just decided to join your organization. But as far as onboarding goes, we lose a lot in terms of the remote world of what some may refer to as creative collisions, or the ability to just, the office walkthrough where you're showing people through various departments. And so something key to not just our onboarding, but our organization as a whole, is relationship building and being intentional about it. Not a meeting goes by where we don't have a check-in. I know, like icebreakers get a bad rap, but they serve a really, really crucial function in a remote environment. And for onboarding, often, it's trial by fire, or whatever metaphor that people go to, drinking from a fire hose. It's recognizing it doesn't need to be that way. You have a lot more to gain by taking your time and allowing folks to absorb a little more slowly at the very beginning, so that it helps them along further down the line. In the actual onboarding guide that we produce for our folks, new hires end up meeting almost everyone in the organization in the first couple of weeks, but there's a huge note at the top that says these meetings could just be emails. We choose intentionally to have them because we find it important that you have these conversations face to face. And we find that that goes a long way with folks being able to set up a relationship at the very beginning that they can work with later on and build from there. One additional thing to that is a key part of equity and inclusion is allowing folks or honoring the differences in how folks approach their work. And so one thing we have at the 19th, which we borrow from a lot of organizations, is something called user guides, where every new hire fills out this 30-question questionnaire about how you operate, how you receive feedback, things at the very beginning that you want to establish at the very beginning, and that you don't want to learn the hard way. You don't want to learn the hard way how someone receives feedback. That you can use your first one-on-one with your manager, or if you're starting a new project with a new team, you can just take a quick peek at the user guide and see, oh, this person prefers to work in this way. Obviously, it can't take place of the nuanced conversations about what you learn about other people along the way, but it's a good start that most organizations don't take the first step to do.
Yes, we're seeing in the comments, people are asking, oh, could you share the user guide, those 30 questions with us afterwards? And a lot of enthusiasm for that. And I have to say, one of the most compelling things about user guides to me is the way that different people like to be appreciated and acknowledged, because it's so different. Sometimes if I want to celebrate somebody, I just proclaim my admiration loudly, to the public, but that is not the way that all people like to be celebrated and appreciated. So just those details, I think, allow different people to feel more comfortable in a space. Thank you for that. And Miki, I wanted to bounce to you on the idea of equity and inclusion and tools that people can use as part of that onboarding process. Is there anything in addition to what Jayo was talking about that you like to see managers put into play, or people who are being hired to ask for, so that they can feel more comfortable in that process?
Absolutely. I think what Jayo mentioned in terms of the user guide, or just using that opportunity and onboarding to learn about new hires, how they work, how they like to be celebrated, and just setting themselves and managers up for success in how to effectively manage them. I would say another piece in that's important for HR departments is that's also a good opportunity to learn about what accommodations they might need. That's one thing that we're seeing, that not all employees sort of have that background or awareness on how to ask for accommodation. So I think as much as HR departments can lead that conversation about just what employees need, whether that's in terms of abilities, access to certain facilities. In this more virtual environment, it's less of a thing, but in terms of when you're planning conferences, thinking about the location and the facilities around that and what your employee base may need from that, I think is really important. So I think just really leveraging that onboarding process and learning how to treat your employees. So we have a lot of more professionals may be familiar with surveys at 3 months and, ongoing throughout the process. But I think that retention and that equity and inclusion can really start, as Jayo mentioned, in that offer letter, but also during that onboarding period, and really being intentional about that. And one thing I like to plug that we advise our clients on is also offering some space during the onboarding process as well. It can be really intense, can be really necessary, but we encourage our clients to offer a discovery day or two where you can just dig into some of the documents that you'll be working with, understanding what people do in your team and organization, and really giving some breath and space to be able to acclimate yourself to a new environment, I think is really important.
Yes, it doesn't have to be like an onslaught that you sort of get spit out of the opposite end of. Yeah. And I think what you said about remote work is also really important, because if people are trying to hire people with different backgrounds and different abilities, people may need accommodations that you aren't aware of, from Zooming with them constantly. So I think that point that opening the door for people to tell you that is going to be so important, even possibly more so in the virtual environment. Thank you. Celen, you have worked with so many people going out into this next level of their careers. What do you see organizations doing that really sets them up for success? Is there anything, you have lots of exposure to lots of organizations. What do you see people doing particularly well?
Yeah, so something that I think is really important is, making sure that there's support and even mentorship for new employees who are joining the organization. I see a lot of the times, employers have a major need to fill a role. And sometimes once they actually hire on for that role, it's like, go, go, go. And I understand that, being thrown into the fire, sometimes it's the best way to learn, but other times it's not. Sometimes support is needed. And so really thinking about like, what does that look like? How can I look at my employee as not just someone sitting there filling a seat doing the job, but looking at them at a human level, getting to know them outside of, the actual day-to-day work, like what makes them tick, what makes them unique. And I think employees who feel valued and have that support system will do better work. So I think it's really important on the employer end to make sure that there are those support systems there, support on the team, support from your managers, or even just a mentor, even from a different team to connect with new employees coming in.
Yes, we hear a lot of good things about mentorship, even if it's somebody from a different part of an organization, because it can help you connect different pieces of this puzzle, which is the organization you're going to be working with. Thank you.
Right.
So we have talked about this whole process of getting to gather a great pool of applicants, talking with people, knowing people, cultivating relationships, bringing people on in ways where you're thinking about equity and inclusion. Then, of course, you've hired somebody and there's retention, which is a place where a lot of people, a lot of organizations fall short. So I'm thinking about how recruiting and hiring and onboarding are just the beginning, and what some of the ways are that an organization can ensure they are spaces where people from diverse backgrounds can thrive and want to stay, as opposed to move on from as quickly as possible. Jayo, how do you think that organizations can work on themselves to be places people want to continue working?
Sure. So my immediate response to that is there's no one size fits all approach that will sort of satisfy and engage the most folks. And so what I said earlier still applies, in that you should ask folks early and often in the most efficient ways that you can. If you don't take in that feedback for things that affect people, they will certainly tell you afterwards, and it might be, I don't know, it might be less pleasant afterwards. And so it's really, really crucial that you take the time to really consider the needs of your staff across areas and get that feedback. There's ways to do it where, as you're going about your work, it's not always just a survey, it's not always just a discussion group. There's as many ways as you can officially build in the listening portals as part of the process, the better. It even helps if your theory of change for your organization or the way you decide to grow requires that input, and that way you don't have to go out of your way to get that input. But yeah, I can't stress enough: ask people early and often what they need, and try to do that proactively.
Wonderful, thank you. And Miki, what are your thoughts on creating these spaces that retain and nurture and grow people?
Absolutely. Well, definitely affirm and underscore what Jayo mentioned, and that for every person, it's different. What might keep me at a job or engaged in an organization may be different than the person sitting right next to me. So I do think that customizing that employment experience as much as you reasonably can, I think is really important. And I think outside of that, what you do, kind of maintaining what you do have control over, which is maintaining and creating the conditions where equity and inclusion and diversity can actually occur within that space. And I think that's where you can utilize and leverage some of the practices that we shared today. But I think controlling the controllables, which is, how you design your compensation, your HR programming, the overall sort of cultural experience, and also offering tools and resources to people that have influence over decision making so that they're creating the right conditions for retention as well.
Thank you. And Celen, you watch so many people start out in these new places. What are you looking at when you think about what may help people want to stay there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of the times for me, what I see is like, what does success look like for me here at this organization? How can I grow within my role? How do I move upward? And so really just, again, going back to transparency on the employer's part is like, what is the roadmap look like for a new employee coming into this org, and how can they grow? A lot of times I see people jump from role to role because there's no room for growth. And so if you want to retain really great talent, just being honest and open about what does success look like and how can you be elevated in your role and get promoted. So that's definitely my take on that.
Absolutely. That there are ways forward, even in a small organization, there can be steps that people can take to feel more fulfilled, even if there's not 1,000 ranks that you can rise through in it. Thank you. So I want to ask one last question, and then we will go to your questions from the audience. So please click on that Q&A tab and drop some questions in, because we'll have a good amount of time to address them. Miki, I wanted to go with you because you work with so many different organizations that are in all different phases of their equity work, from people who are just starting to even think about what that means to organizations that are very in touch with their audience and community, have a lot of connections there, and have a staff that's very representative. For those organizations that have advanced so far, what's sort of like the next step in equity and inclusion work? Where can people who have come far continue to go forward?
Absolutely. So at Nonprofit HR, in our DEI practice, we take most organizations through a 3-phase sort of process when it comes to DEI. The first phase is discovery and assessment. That's where we develop a shared understanding of what is DEI and what does that mean to you and to your organization, and sort of what is the current state of DEI, including belonging at the organization, and taking that information that we learned from discovery and assessment and developing a DEI strategic roadmap where that has specific activities, initiatives, things that if you implement may positively impact those conditions within the organization. And phase 3, that's really that ongoing process, because we know that there's no sort of end goal in DEI. There's really an aspirational vision that the organization is trying to get to. For me, a success story with one of my clients is that, when you're on a call and an issue of equity and inclusion comes up, they're able to sort of troubleshoot that in real time, where people feel comfortable voicing concerns or critique or feedback. And then there's pathways to resolve that. And they can sort of have that practice and build up that practice to be able to engage that dialogue in real time and even come up with resolutions in real time. So what we see is sort of as organizations become more comfortable in sort of building that muscle to respond to DEI, then they can sort of do that in-house. And eventually they'll get to a point where they may not need a nonprofit HR, maybe just as an advisory, but really, because you'll have to engage DEI for, as long as you may, have your mission in mind. But I think as long as you can sort of build that into the culture and the operation of the organization, you can really see success.
Thank you. And yeah, I want to highlight one thing that you mentioned there as well, just to include it in the conversation, that this idea that people need to know who they can go to with a problem. I mean, so many people in so many organizations really don't know what their chain of reporting is if they can't go to their direct supervisor. So that can be a source of real frustration, and something that organizations can address by telling people what that pathway can be. Thank you so much. So we've got some great questions here. We're going to bounce over to these, and I'll just toss these out to our wonderful panelists. We're talking about representation of communities, something that businesses, news organizations, nonprofits certainly think about. Who is within their community? Who are they serving? Especially for more dispersed organizations that aren't really bound to a locality. How do you think about community? Anybody can jump right in.
Yeah, the way I think about community is thinking about your mission. So it is about, the regions that you operate and that your organization may be present or placed. But I think when you think about your mission, and most organizations, when they think about their mission and their vision, they're pretty broad reaching. They may impact sort of one area, if it's children, if it's, people of color, that's a really broad place. And so that community is sort of, where you can start to think of. If you're in a geographic location that may not be really diverse, but you think about your mission that impacts this large group of people that I imagine is potentially pretty diverse. So if you can't go to your direct geographic location, think about how your mission and your work impacts a community. And I can tell you there's probably more diversity there. And again, that's something that's also helped by the fact that we're a little bit more mobile in our working and able to interact across regions geographically, even globally. And so I think sometimes you have to sort of put that in context as well. If you are an organization with a global mission, you may have to start to think about those different audiences and communities and segment that and think about that. As an example, there's an organization that does have a global mission, but a lot of their organizational roles, you have to be an English speaker. And so how can that organization be, more inclusive to that broader community by sort of maybe offering pathways into that organization so that they can have a voice as well?
Thank you so much, Miki. And Jayo, I know that the 19th serves a widely dispersed audience. How do you think about this? How do you think of representation and community?
Sure. Yeah. It comes down to the intentionality and the specifics that Miki was talking about it specifically. I don't know who said it, but it was if you serve everyone, you end up serving no one. And so again, looking to your mission and the 19th mission, being very clear that we are in service of women of color and LGBTQ plus folks, as well as women. And so being very specific about the needs and not just sort of profiled needs, but the actual needs that those communities tell us. And so we have a very strong audience engagement team that is obviously as their function being very immersed in what our targeted audiences are and audiences and not having a one size fits all as to what those different audiences are responding to. And that goes for the communities that you want to build with employment as well.
Yes, I think that's so important. Thank you for that. And I think that, just as we have all been talking about how you don't have to guess what's important to your employees, you can ask them. I mean, a lot of INN members are deeply involved in conversation with their audiences and asking the audiences what they need and not deciding what those audiences need, so it's more of the questions coming from the people, the needs coming from the people who are being served. So I think there's a little bit of a parallel there to the way we can look at working with employees in an organization too. Let's go to another question here. Leah asks, do you have any specific advice around diversity, equity, inclusion in regards to recruiting new board members? This is a question that comes up fairly often for nonprofits.
The one advisory I'd give is I think because the laws aren't so let's say restrictive or so formed in terms of recruiting board members as they are with employment, then sort of organizations don't take the necessary steps to do a full search when it comes to board members. And what ends up happening is that you're limited by the networks that your current board and your current community will have. And so it has the same issues as employment hiring, where you're only tapping into your small network. And so in the ways that you can, building a search, and there are sites that do support. I do believe Idealist has a tab just for board members, for folks wanting to seek a position that interests them.
Thank you. Celen, I think this question would go very well to you. Rhiannon's asking, how do you identify experienced workers who may have been underestimated in past jobs? Because she's looking to hire representative staff of all ages and all levels. And I feel like that's something that a lot of the co-opers experience, that they've been underestimated in some extent.
Yeah, definitely. I think going back to my point of looking them outside of their, current skill set and their, past experiences, looking at them more broadly about what they can bring to the table, what transferable skills they have, whether, they're being underestimated or they have less experience, more experience, whatever the case may be. We don't just work with entry-level talent, either. So we have mid-level talent and people of older ages as well. So not just young folks, but, it's a mixed bag. So I think just looking beyond their current skill set. And I think, again, just like looking outside of your current network, I think that's super important as well. Digging into a different talent pool, looking at different orgs who have diverse talent. So like a co-op, if it's not a co-op, who else in the space is doing work with diverse candidates? So really just finding those orgs where you can tap into and starting there. Because I know sometimes it could be hard to find, like, where do I even look for these folks? So really tapping into orgs who are doing the work on their end. So, yeah.
Yeah, there are so many organizations that people can reach out to that are working with people who have been underestimated. And I also find that if you look at a resume closely, you can learn a lot about people. Sometimes we just read the bulleted points, like this was their job, this was their job, this was their job. But even people who are being underestimated or who aren't in leadership positions and never have been at their work sometimes find ways to show you that they are a leader or that they have a lot of different skills, whether it's what they do outside of work or roles that they've taken on at work, or if you call up references, you can hear it from them. So it takes a little more detailed search, but I think sometimes people are telling you that, just not in the most direct way, which is that they've had that exact job.
Right.
I have another question here from Tom. What have been the most effective tools and services that any of you have used to identify and recruit diverse candidates?
I would say that there's not one tool that I would say. I think a lot of recruiters utilize LinkedIn or leverage social media to sort of identify people who are in the field or sort of in that sort of profession. But I think the best tool is to diversify your approach. If you've been relying on just your applicant tracking system and just sort of the traditional ways that you've sort of pushed out, roles and then hoped for the best in terms of your applicant pool, I would, again, diversify your approach to that. So some might be sourcing or building relationships, like Jayo mentioned, ideally before you get to sort of needing that position in the door, leveraging LinkedIn, leveraging even where you find working groups that are dedicated to a certain topic and actually engaging in those groups ideally before you may need to hire that talent, so you can build up that healthy pipeline. But I think in the world that we're in, sort of that hoping for the best in terms of attracting talent is not the most effective right now, but to really sort of where can you be where the applicants are. And I think that's sort of a confluence of everything that Jayo and Celen have mentioned in their talks as well.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Miki said, is actually engaging with your communities. A lot of the times, like in the work that I do and the partners that I'm working with, they're always saying they want to hire diverse talent, but what are they actually doing to get there? And I think, being able to engage and give back and build that diverse pipeline of candidates, even before you actually need to hire someone, is super important. Whether that be through mentorship or getting connected to different organizations who are doing the work and have the candidates. How are you, being of help to them so that they can also be of help to you in the long run?
Just one last thing to add to that is, yes, diversifying is key to it. Diversifying your methods, but overlooked often in orgs is that staff become key and instrumental in outreach. The 19th, the most successful hires, recruiting rounds that we've had were rounds that the team members themselves, the department members themselves were heavily involved in with regards to outreach. I mean, helping seek out folks. It multiplies your network, especially if you have a diverse staff. That's an example of leveraging the diversity that you already have on staff, and they want to help.
I think that's a great point, that your staff is also highly invested in the team that you're building and can also be out there meeting different people and in different spaces, bringing people on. I wanted to ask, panel, if you have any thoughts of anything we haven't touched on that you think is really important that people think about as they think about who their community is, how to connect with that community, how to represent that community, and how to really bring people into their organizations in an equitable and inclusive way. Have we just sailed past anything we really should talk about?
One thing that I always like to lift up in group settings like these is a term that I hear a lot that I think is kind of problematic, is when we start to say we're looking for diverse candidates. So it's understanding that one person is not in itself diverse. Diversity is in relation to a group or a space. And so I think that as organizations get more comfortable sort of using terminology and language, I think that's just something important to consider, is that it's not just, we're really looking for and honing in on people of color, but really understanding, going back to that intentionality and what are you trying to build, and understanding that you need diversity in order to do that, especially if you're serving a mission, understanding that without diversity, it's kind of insufficient at this point to really meet the needs. So I think understanding that not one person is diverse, and it's not necessarily just targeting any specific representative or visible demographic, but really understanding the purpose of why you're trying to be more diverse and equitable and inclusive.
Absolutely. And looking at the totality of the organization together. Thank you, Miki. That's wonderful. Jayo, did you have a thought on that?
Something I like to highlight in conversations like this, and what I think all of us have mentioned, is a great deal of intentionality in terms of process. And you're doing work, you have to put some work into it. And what many people rightly say is, especially in our context, our business is the news. And at times, that takes up all of our urgency. And where were you going to find the time to build these processes and involve everyone in? And so my first sort of sassy retort to that would be that the average amount of time spent into equity processes before was 0. I mean, it was so bad that in the last couple of years, entire newsrooms had to rise up to say that it was in a poor state. And so everything that is going to feel like more work because the previous amount of work was 0. And so with that frame point of view, you really have to start recognizing that you're going to have to give something up as a result of being able to prioritize equity and inclusion in your organization. It would help if it was already part of your mission. That way it doesn't feel like a mission creep. We don't have equity initiatives in our organization. We don't have inclusion initiatives. It's just part of how we operate. And that way it doesn't feel like extra work. But if you're in the other boat, to start recognizing that, of course, this is laborious because the previous labor was 0.
Thank you so much. And we're coming up against the end of our time together. Panelists, I appreciate you so, so much. Celen, Miki, Jayo, it's wonderful to be in conversation with you. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us.